The mornings always came quietly for Evan Parker, the kind of quiet that only belonged to those who lived on the edges of other people's lives. At 15, he had already learned what many grown men never understood, that surviving sometimes meant becoming small, becoming silent, becoming a shadow that the world simply stepped around without noticing. Behind the Iron Cross clubhouse, tucked between a dented dumpster and the tall chain-link fence, he had carved out a place that felt almost safe. It was nothing more than flattened cardboard laid across gravel in a tarp that flapped when the wind shifted. But to a boy with nowhere else to go, it was a little corner of the world that belonged to him. He woke before dawn every day, not because he wanted to greet the sun, but because sunrise meant voices, engines, footsteps, and he could not risk being found. He folded his cardboard as carefully as someone folding their best Sunday shirt and tucked it into a torn backpack that had more patches than fabric. Every movement was quiet, measured, as if even the bricks around him were listening. Sometimes he paused with a hand against the ground, feeling the coolness of the morning reach up through his palm, reminding him he was still here, still breathing, still fighting through another day. He slipped out through a narrow gap in the fence that only a hungry, undersized teenager would think to squeeze through. Out on the early morning streets, he kept his head lowered and his steps steady. The neighborhood was still waking up, porch lights glowing like distant stars, dogs barking at nothing in particular, sprinklers ticking across empty yards. Evan moved through it all like a whisper, his focus on the recycling bins lined neatly in front of quiet homes. He lifted each lid, gently collecting cans with the soft clinking sound that had become the rhythm of his life. Most folks never saw him. Those who did probably assumed he belonged to someone around the corner. That was fine with him. The fewer eyes on him, the safer he felt. There was a comfort in being unnoticed, a strange kind of shield that kept trouble at bay. He had learned that lesson long ago in houses that smelled of other people's meals and rules that changed with the weather. Being invisible had kept him alive in places where kindness was rare and tempers were quick to rise. By midday, he made his way to the scrapyard where the workers barely glanced at him anymore. A handful of coins slid across the counter into his palm, enough for a sandwich and a bottle of water, sometimes even a small bag of chips if he had collected well that morning. He always chose the same corner of the gas station parking lot to sit and eat, not out of preference, but out of habit. Habits he had discovered were safer than taking chances. When the sun climbed high above the roofs and shadows shortened, Evan slipped back toward the clubhouse. The alley behind it smelled of engine oil, dust, and old brick warmed by the afternoon heat. He sat with his back against the wall, hidden behind the dumpster, watching the world through a narrow slice of space. It was his window into a life that felt impossibly distant from his own. He watched the men of the Iron Cross come and go, their boots heavy against the pavement, their laughter bouncing off the walls. They looked like men carved from stone, broad-shouldered, weathered, confident in ways Evan could not understand. Their leather vests told stories he would never hear, stories stitched in patches and scars. He watched them without envy, only a quiet fascination, the kind a lonely boy feels when witnessing a world he knows he will never belong to. Evan had rules, simple ones, that kept him safe. Never be seen. Never be remembered. Never cause a problem. These rules wrapped around him like a second skin, shaping every step he took. But even with all his caution, even with all the ways he tried to disappear, the world around him was changing. Something in the air felt different. A shift like the quiet before a summer storm when the wind pauses and the sky feels heavy. If he had known then how those changes would pull him out of the shadows, how they would lead him into the lives of people he had only watched from afar, he might have run. He might have gathered his cardboard, his tarp, and his worn backpack and disappeared from Riverside altogether. But the truth was simple. Evan Parker was tired of running, tired of being alone, tired of surviving instead of living. And sometimes, whether a boy knows it or not, life has a way of finding him even in the hidden places where he thinks no one will ever look. The afternoons carried a different kind of quiet behind the Iron Cross clubhouse, a warm stillness that settled over the parking lot like a worn blanket. By the time Evan slipped back through the narrow fence gap each day, the sun had begun its slow descent, and the shadows stretched long across the cracked pavement. This was the hour he liked best, the time when the world softened just enough for him to sit still and watch without feeling the weight of survival pressing quite so hard. From his hidden corner beside the dumpster, Evan could see nearly everything. He watched the bikes roll in their engines, rumbling low like distant thunder, the sound echoing against the brick and metal. The bikers walked with a confidence that came from knowing they belonged somewhere, that there was a place in the world carved out just for them. He didn't envy them, not exactly, but there was a tug in his chest each time he watched them gather. A pull towards something he had never known, something steady and warm like the glow of a porch light left on at night. But it wasn't the men who held his attention most. It was the little girl who arrived every afternoon with her pink backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Lily Morgan came running out of the clubhouse door with the energy only a child can carry, her laughter floating across the lot as light as the breeze. And behind her, always steady, always watching, was her father, Caleb Morgan. Caleb was not the kind of man Evan would have dared approach under normal circumstances. Broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, built like someone who had seen too much of the world and refused to be broken by it. Yet when Lily sprinted toward him, his whole face changed. The hard lines softened, the stern gaze warmed, and a smile touched his eyes in a way that made Evan pause every time. It was like watching a storm turn to sunlight. Caleb would lift Lily into his arms, spinning her once, twice, just enough to make her giggle. Then he would set her on the seat of his bike, fastening her tiny helmet with a tenderness that didn't match his rough exterior. He listened to her chatter with full attention, nodding along as she told stories about school or a picture she had drawn or a new friend she had made. Evan watched those moments with a quiet ache settling deep inside him, the kind that came from memories he barely held, any more memories of a mother's voice or the shadow of a bedtime story long forgotten. Sometimes as he leaned against the dumpster, Evan wondered what it would feel like to have someone look at him the way Caleb looked at Lily. Not with pity or irritation or the tired frustration he had seen in so many foster homes, but with a steady kind of love that said, "You belong here. You are mine. You matter." The other bikers were no different with Lily. They crouched down to greet her, offered her candy, or let her draw little pictures on their arms with washable markers. They treated her like she was everyone's child, not just Caleb's. There was a gentleness in them around her that made Evan's chest tighten in an unfamiliar way. These men who looked like they could break bricks with their bare hands softened into uncles with warm grins and patient nods when Lily appeared. Watching them, Evan began to notice something else too. Their brotherhood was not loud or boastful. It was quiet, steady, woven through their days with a certainty he had never experienced. They fixed bikes together, shared meals, helped each other without being asked. It was the kind of loyalty he had spent his whole life searching for, though he had never put it into words. Sometimes he wondered if people were born knowing where they belonged, or if they found it by accident, stumbling into the right place at the right moment. He wondered if maybe a boy like him could someday be seen by people like them. But those were thoughts he pushed away quickly. Hope was a dangerous thing for someone who had learned to survive without it. Still, every afternoon, Evan returned to that spot behind the dumpster. Not because it was safe, but because watching Caleb and Lily made him feel a small flicker of something he had almost forgotten. Something gentle and warm, something like the beginning of belonging. The first time Evan noticed the silver sedan, he didn't think much of it. Cars passed through that stretch of road all day long, some stopping at the corner store, others heading to the laundromat or the warehouse district farther down. But the second day, when the same silver car eased down the street at the same hour, his attention sharpened. By the fourth day, he no longer pretended it was coincidence. From his hiding place behind the dumpster, he watched the sedan move slow, as a drifting cloud, never coming close to the clubhouse entrance, never drawing attention. It simply rolled by, turned at the corner, circled around again. The windows were dark, so dark that sunlight slid across them without revealing anything inside. But Evan didn't need to see the driver's face to know something was wrong. He felt it deep in his bones, the way a stray dog senses danger before anyone else notices the shift in the wind. He had lived enough years in enough unstable homes to recognize the patterns of a predator. Some folks smiled too wide. Some walked too quietly. Some waited in shadows, pretending patience. But the worst kind were the ones who watched from behind glass, waiting for the right moment to close in. Evan had seen that kind before. He had spent too many nights protecting smaller kids in houses where tempers changed at dusk and footsteps in the hall meant trouble. So on the fifth afternoon, when Lily burst through the clubhouse door with her backpack bouncing, Evan's whole body went tense. The sedan had just turned onto the block, its brake lights glowing faintly as it slowed near the curb. His stomach dropped, a cold, heavy weight settling inside him. There was no doubt anymore. Whoever was in that car wasn't driving past out of habit. They were watching, studying, choosing. Evan pressed deeper into the shadows, peering between the rusted metal of the dumpster and the brick wall. Lily ran straight into Caleb's arms, her laughter ringing across the lot. Caleb spun her once, her small boots kicking in the air, and Evan found himself holding his breath. He glanced back toward the street. The car had stopped, now idling so quietly he could barely hear the engine. It sat at an angle that gave a perfect view of the parking lot. The hairs on his arms lifted. He told himself he needed more information. That maybe he was wrong, that maybe he was letting old fears cloud his mind. But the truth was simple. He had stayed alive this long because he listened to the warnings that rose inside him like smoke before a fire. He had learned to trust those whispers more than he trusted adults, more than he trusted hope, more than he trusted anything else. For several moments, the street remained still. Lily clung to Caleb's neck, telling him something about her day while he nodded patiently. Only when Caleb carried her inside did the sedan slowly roll away, disappearing around the corner as if nothing unusual had happened. But Evan didn't relax. Not that day. Not the next. Each afternoon he waited for the same car, and each afternoon it appeared right on time, as predictable as the setting sun. Every day it slowed. Every day it watched. And every day Evan felt a growing pressure in his chest, as if the walls of his hiding place were shrinking around him. He thought about telling someone, but who would listen to a homeless teenager hiding behind a dumpster, who would believe the quiet boy with the haunted eyes over the steady hum of daily life? People rarely listened to kids like him, even on the best of days. So he stayed silent. He watched. He paid attention. He counted the passes, memorized the sound of the engine, the way the car drifted toward the curb. And with each passing day, one thought settled deeper into his mind. That car was not circling the clubhouse. It was circling Lily. The afternoon light on that August day carried a strange heaviness, the kind that settles in the air before anything truly terrible happens. Evan felt it the moment he slipped back behind the dumpster, the way a bird might sense a storm long before clouds gather. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was only the heat, but the feeling clung to him like a second skin. He pulled his knees to his chest and watched the lot through the familiar sliver of space. Everything looked as usual at first. The clubhouse door swung open now and then, letting out the steady hum of voices. A few of the bikers were working near the far fence, tools clinking softly. Nothing seemed out of place. But then he heard it. The low purr of an engine he had come to recognize all too well. He didn't have to look to know the silver sedan had turned onto the block. His pulse quickened. He leaned forward, peering around the dumpster just enough to see the car creeping along the curb. It slowed more than usual this time. Slowed enough that Evan's breath caught. Inside the clubhouse, Caleb was somewhere with Lily, probably pouring her a juice box or listening to her ramble about school. In another minute she would come running out the door with that bright smile she carried like a blessing. And the sedan was waiting for her. Evan's fingers dug into the gravel beside him. His body tightened as if preparing for a blow. He felt danger in the air, sharp and unmistakable, the same way he had felt it in the worst foster homes when footsteps approached after midnight. His instincts screamed, "Move." The clubhouse door opened. Lily burst out, her small feet pattering across the pavement, her pink backpack bouncing behind her. She was calling for her father with all the carefree joy only a child protected by love could ever know. Caleb stepped outside with a smile already forming, his arms opening to gather her in. That was when the car door swung wide. A man stepped out. Not rushed, not panicked, but with a cold certainty that made Evan's stomach twist. His hand slid inside his jacket. Evan had seen that motion before in places he refused to think about. He didn't need to see the gun to know it was there. For a split second, the world held still. Caleb had his back to the street. Lily was mid-stride. No one else noticed. No one else saw the danger rising like a shadow behind them. Except Evan. He didn't think. Thinking took time, and time was something Lily no longer had. His body moved on its own, propelled by a force he couldn't name. He shot out from behind the dumpster, feet pounding across the asphalt. His lungs burned, but he didn't slow. The man drew the gun. The barrel lifted, and Evan ran harder. The first gunshot cracked the air like a breaking bone. A flash of light. A roar that shook the parking lot. Something slammed into Evan's shoulder, a blow so fierce it felt like fire ripping through him. His body jerked to the side, but his legs kept pushing. The second shot came before he could catch a breath. This one punched deep into his ribs, stealing the world out from under him. He stumbled, falling forward, but he refused to crumple. Lily was behind him. She had to stay behind him. The third bullet grazed his head as he crashed to the ground, hot pain tearing across his temple. The pavement rushed up rough and unyielding. His cheek struck the asphalt, and everything blurred into red and white. Voices erupted. Screams. Boots pounding. A bike engine roaring to life somewhere in the distance. But Evan heard none of it clearly. The world was fading, slipping from his grasp like sand through his fingers. In the corner of his vision, he saw Lily's pink sneakers. Still standing. Still safe. He had made it in time. His chest rose once shallow and trembling. His eyes fluttered, and as darkness wrapped around him, one final thought drifted through his mind, soft and simple. She's alive. For a long moment, Caleb Morgan could not understand what he was seeing. 1 second, Lily had been running toward him, her small voice ringing across the lot, bright as birdsong. The next, a thin boy he had never seen before came hurtling out from behind the dumpster like a gust of wind. Before Caleb could even turn fully toward Lily, the gunshots had shattered the afternoon calm. He heard the first shot and spun around just in time to see the boy take the hit. The child's body twisted under the impact, but instead of falling away, he kept going. Caleb stood frozen, the world narrowing to that impossible sight, that brave and desperate sprint. Then came the second shot, and the boy's legs buckled. The third carved through the air and sent him crashing to the pavement. Lily screamed a sound that tore straight through Caleb's chest. He lunged toward her, scooping her into his arms, running trembling hands over her arms and legs, searching for blood, searching for wounds he prayed he would never find. She clung to him, sobbing into his shoulder, her little hands gripping his shirt like she feared the world might split open beneath her feet. Only when he was certain she was unhurt did he look toward the boy on the ground. The sight would live with him forever. The young stranger lay twisted on the asphalt, his body small and fragile against the harsh brightness of the day. A pool of dark red spread beneath him, seeping into the cracks of the pavement. His eyes were half open, unfocused, staring at nothing. Caleb felt the breath leave his lungs. He hadn't known the boy existed until this moment, yet the child had thrown himself into danger, for Lily had placed his thin body between a gunman and a little girl he had no reason to protect. Caleb felt something break inside him. Gratitude and grief swelled at once, tangled so tightly he could not separate them. The clubhouse erupted with noise as the others rushed outside, their curses and shouts filling the air. Someone ran toward the fleeing sedan. Someone else called for help. But Caleb dropped to his knees beside the boy, setting Lily down gently behind him, as if shielding her from the truth of what lay before them. "Stay with me," Caleb whispered, his voice raw. He pressed his hands against the wound in the boy's side, feeling warm blood spill between his fingers. "Stay with me, son." "Hold on." The boy did not respond. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics worked with practiced urgency. They checked his pulse, lifted him onto the stretcher, and began shouting numbers Caleb did not understand. Twice during the frantic rush to the ambulance, the boy's heart stopped. Twice they shocked him back. Each time Caleb felt his own heart freeze in his chest. As they loaded the boy into the back of the ambulance, one of the paramedics turned to Caleb. "We're taking him to County General. He's critical." Critical. The word hit like a hammer. Caleb looked down at his hands. They were covered in blood. Not Lily's. Not his own. The blood of a child. He had never noticed a child who had saved his daughter's life without hesitation. Later, standing alone in the hospital waiting room with Lily curled against him in exhausted silence, the scene replayed in his mind in agonizing loops. The running. The gunshots. The boy's small body falling. The stillness after. He did not even know the boy's name. But he knew one truth with painful clarity. That child had laid down his life for Lily. And Caleb Morgan would carry that weight for the rest of his days. At County General, the fluorescent lights seemed far too bright, almost cruel in the way they revealed every fear on Caleb's face. He sat in a plastic chair with Lily tucked tightly against his chest, her small fingers tangled in his shirt as if letting go might somehow erase the last few hours. The room buzzed with muted conversations and distant footsteps, but for Caleb everything felt strangely quiet, as though the world itself was holding its breath. A murmur rose near the admitting desk where the paramedics were speaking with a nurse. Caleb didn't pay much attention at first. His mind was fixed on one thing, only the boy whose blood still dried on his hands. The boy who had nearly died saving Lily. But then one of the paramedics lifted a sealed evidence bag and something in the shape inside it caught Caleb's eye. A photograph. The paramedic handed it to the nurse, who inspected it briefly before placing it with the boy's personal effects. And though they were halfway across the room, Caleb felt a tug of recognition, a whisper from the past drifting through the sterile air. He stood gently shifting Lily to his uninjured arm and walked toward the desk. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice still hoarse from shouting and fear. "That photo. May I see it?" The nurse hesitated, glancing at the sealed bag. "It was found in the boy's pocket," she said. "We're required to document everything." "I know," Caleb replied. I think I might recognize it." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because after a moment she handed the bag to him. Caleb lifted it carefully. Inside, folded and worn from years of being carried, was a photograph he hadn't seen in more than a decade. The edges were frayed, the ink dull, but the moment it touched his hands, the world shifted beneath him. It was Grace. Grace Parker, standing in front of an old city park, sunlight caught in her hair, her smile soft and bright, the way it had always been when she looked at him. But it wasn't Grace's face that made Caleb's breath leave him. It was the baby in her arms, a small, dark-haired infant cradled against her chest, a child who could not have been more than 6 months old. His heart pounded loud and unsteady. Grace. And a baby. A baby from the same year she had walked out of his life without warning, leaving behind nothing but a short note and unanswered questions that had haunted him ever since. He turned the photograph over. 3 words were written on the back in her familiar handwriting, soft loops and careful strokes he could still recognize even after all these years. "Evan, my everything." The hospital noises faded. The chairs and nurses and harsh lights disappeared. All he could see was Grace, 22 years old, holding a child he had never known existed. His legs threatened to give way, and he gripped the counter to steady himself. "Sir, are you all right?" the nurse asked gently. Caleb swallowed hard, his voice barely more than a whisper. "That boy. The one who was shot. His name is Evan. That's what we believe," she said. It was written on the back of the photograph. He looked down at the bag again, at the picture that had survived more years of hardship than any child ever should have. A memory from another life. A truth he had never been given the chance to hold. Grace had vanished 16 years ago. Disappeared without explanation. He had searched, prayed, waited, only to learn later she had died in an accident he could not understand. But now, standing in the middle of a hospital that smelled of antiseptic and sorrow, he realized something he could barely process. She had been pregnant when she left. She had raised their son alone. And now that boy, that young stranger who had thrown his small body in front of bullets, meant for Lily was very likely his blood. His child. His son. Caleb pressed the photograph to his chest, closed his eyes, and whispered the only words he could manage. "I should have been there." Detective Helen Brooks had been with the Riverside Police Department long enough to know that every tragedy carried a story beneath the surface, a story stitched together by moments of pain and choices no one ever saw. She stood in the dimly lit hallway outside the trauma unit, a manila folder tucked under her arm, watching Caleb with quiet understanding as he held the photograph of Grace as if it were a lifeline. She approached him gently, her steps slow and deliberate. She had seen hardened men crumble in these halls after shootings, accidents, and losses that couldn't be mended. But there was something different in Caleb's eyes now, something deeper than fear or shock. It was grief mixed with dawning responsibility, the kind that comes when the truth lands too heavy to ignore. "Caleb," she said softly, offering the folder. "There's something you need to see. It's about Evan." He took the folder with careful hands, almost afraid of what it might hold. He opened it slowly. The first page was an intake form from 14 years earlier, listing a small boy with wide, uncertain eyes who had lost his mother in a single night. Evan Parker. Age 2 years, 4 months. No listed father. No relatives willing to claim him. Caleb felt his chest tighten. Helen continued with a quiet steadiness. "I pulled his file from Child Protective Services. It's not easy reading." That was an understatement. Each page told a chapter of Evan's life that no child should ever have lived. The Talbots, his first foster placement, had kept him for 8 months before returning him with the comment that he was too withdrawn, too difficult, too sad. Caleb stared at the notes, imagining a little boy clutching the last thread of his mother's memory, placed in a stranger's home and expected to simply adapt. The Dentons came next. Their name appeared in bold above a list of concerns. Neglect suspected. Bruises unexplained. Evan at age 4, thin, frightened, too quiet, even for a grieving child. A photograph from a social worker's home visit lay attached by a paperclip. Evan's eyes in that picture told more truth than any report ever could. They were the eyes of a child learning the world was not a safe place. Caleb turned the pages slowly, each one heavier than the last. He paused at the Whitlocks, the only family who gave the boy more than a year of stability. The notes described him as shy, but improving, sleeping better, beginning to trust. But when Mr. Whitlock passed away, suddenly Evan was moved again, torn from the only home that had ever given him a hint of peace. He didn't speak for weeks afterward. Helen pointed to the next section. "This is where things get harder. The Crawfords. A strict household, overly so. Rules layered upon rules. The file didn't list the punishments, but the school records did. Absences. Injuries. A child who flinched when teachers raised their voices. Evan had run away 4 times before his 12th birthday. Each time they brought him back. Each time he tried again. Caleb shut his eyes for a moment, gripping the edges of the folder until his knuckles whitened. He had been riding motorcycles, raising Lily, living his life while his own son had been suffering miles away, unseen and unprotected. Then came the Bishops, his final placement. A household described as barely functional, motivated more by foster stipends than compassion. When Evan tried to talk about the photograph of his mother, the newspaper clippings he collected, the questions he asked about the Iron Cross, the reaction was anger. He ran away at 14 and never returned. He had one question, Helen said quietly. He asked every social worker the same thing for years. Caleb's voice was rough. What was it? Who is my father? Does he want me? Caleb closed the folder, pressing it to his chest, the way he had pressed the photograph earlier. He felt something break open inside him, something raw and aching. All those years, Evan had been searching for a man who didn't even know he existed. And now that the truth had found him, Caleb vowed in a quiet, steady whisper that he would never let that boy go unseen again. Detective Helen Brooks had seen patterns like this before, the kind that threaded quietly through the years, unnoticed by most, until something terrible finally dragged them into the light. As she stood beside Caleb in the quiet corner of the hospital hallway, she unfolded several printed pages clipped together, each one marked with dates stretching back more than a decade. She handed them to him gently, knowing they carried truths that would weigh heavily on any man, especially one already carrying so much. These are the surveillance notes from Evan's former social worker, she said. You need to read them. Caleb held the papers with a careful grip, his shoulder still aching from tension and the memory of gunfire. The hallway hummed with the soft beeping of machines and the murmur of nurses moving from room to room, but his focus was locked on the words in front of him. The first note was dated nearly 2 years earlier. Unidentified male in silver sedan observed parked across from Evan's school. Appears to be watching. Unable to confirm plate number. A chill moved through Caleb. He read the next entry. Male in silver sedan followed Evan's bus route for 3 consecutive afternoons. No interaction, but behavior appears intentional. He felt his jaw tighten. Evan had been 10 years old, then already moving between homes, already learning to disappear into the shadows of other people's lives. And someone had been watching him. Helen spoke softly. These reports weren't taken seriously at the time. Happens more often than it should. One child slips through the cracks and their warnings are brushed aside. Caleb kept reading. Evan located at bus station 40 miles from assigned home. Photograph found in hand. Subject frightened, states he felt someone was following him. That same photograph, the one of Grace holding her infant son, was the only thing Evan had kept. The only piece of his past he refused to let go of. Caleb closed his eyes, imagining a frightened 12-year-old boy alone in a bus station clutching that picture like a lifeline while a stranger circled nearby. What kind of person follows a child for years? Caleb murmured, and why Helen hesitated before answering. She was a seasoned detective, not easily shaken, but even she seemed unsettled by the pattern emerging. We know the silver sedan wasn't random, and we know it has been circling your clubhouse for weeks. Whoever pulled the trigger wasn't there for Lily at first. Caleb's breath caught. They were after Evan. Helen nodded. Yes. Ness. And that leads us to something else. From her coat pocket, she pulled a thin file older than the others. She opened it to a page containing a faded photograph of wreckage pulled from a river. Caleb's chest tightened as he recognized the remnants of Grace's car, twisted and waterlogged. For years, Helen began, everyone believed Grace's death was a tragic accident. Rain. Slick roads. Limited visibility. But when we looked closer, she pointed to a detail highlighted in blue ink. Rear bumper damage. Impact consistent with being struck by another vehicle. Paint transfer present. Caleb felt the blood drain from his face. It wasn't an accident, Helen continued. Someone hit her car hard enough to send her over the guardrail. The hallway seemed to tilt slightly around him. Grace. Young, gentle Grace. A mother trying to keep her child safe. A woman who had walked away from him without explanation, leaving behind nothing but 8 handwritten words. I can't do this life. I'm sorry. Now he understood the fear behind those words. The urgency. The way she had vanished as though running from a ghost. She had been running from someone real. The silver sedan. The same type of car parked outside his clubhouse. The same presence that had stalked Evan from school to bus stations to back alleys. Caleb steadied himself against the wall, the truth settling with a weight that felt too heavy for his still healing heart. Grace hadn't abandoned him. She had been hunted. And now that Hunter had turned his sights on her son, Caleb closed the file slowly, his voice thick but steady. Whoever did this followed Evan all his life, he said. But they made one mistake. Helen lifted her eyes. What's that? They came after him in my town. There was no anger in his tone, only a quiet promise. A promise that the boy who had spent years unseen would remain invisible no longer. Detective Helen Brooks returned the next morning with a look Caleb recognized instantly. It was the expression of someone who had spent the night sifting through years of forgotten files and dust-covered records, and had finally pulled a long-buried truth into the light. She carried a thick folder under her arm, heavier than the one before, as though the weight of its contents could bend the paper itself. We found him, she said quietly, sitting down beside Caleb in the dimly lit waiting area where he kept vigil outside Evan's ICU room. The man in the silver sedan. Caleb straightened his aching shoulder, forgotten. Who is he? Helen opened the folder, revealing a photograph of a stern-faced man in his early 50s. His jaw was set hard, his eyes cold, his posture rigid with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had spent years under military discipline. Even in a picture, the man's presence carried a quiet threat. "His name is Thomas Caldwell," Helen said. "He's Grace's uncle, her only living relative after her parents died." Caleb felt the breath leave him. He remembered Grace mentioning an uncle once or twice, a man who'd stepped in after tragedy had struck her family. But she had spoken of him cautiously, as though choosing her words carefully, not wanting to reveal the full story. Helen continued, her voice steady. "He raised Grace from the time she was 9. And from everything we've been able to gather, he controlled every part of her life. How she dressed, where she went, who she could see. He was strict, overprotective. Some neighbors described him as obsessive." Caleb stared at the photograph. The man's eyes were sharp, disciplined, but there was something darker there too, something unyielding. "When Grace met you," Helen said, "he didn't approve. Not even a little." Caleb blinked slowly. "She told me he didn't like the idea of her being with someone from the club. I didn't think it was anything serious. It was for him." Helen pulled out a statement from an old witness interview. "He confronted her once in the diner parking lot, told her she was throwing away her future, that you were dragging her into a dangerous life. When she wouldn't back down, he stopped speaking to her." Caleb felt a familiar heaviness form in his chest. Grace had been young, hopeful, caught between the life she wanted to build and the life someone else demanded of her. Helen flipped to another page, this one older. The paper yellowed with time. "This is from the state psych evaluator assigned to Caldwell's military retirement review. They were concerned about his fixation on protecting Grace even years after she became an adult. He believed her choices reflected on him. The doctor wrote that he had difficulty letting her go." Caleb stared at the words until they blurred. Then Helen said softly, "He also believed the baby she carried ruined her life." Caleb lifted his eyes sharply. She met his gaze with steady calm. Caldwell saw her pregnancy as the final betrayal. In his mind, she'd thrown everything away because of the club. "Because of you." A cold realization crept through Caleb. So he killed her. Helen nodded slowly. "It took us years to see it. Her crash was written off as an accident. But given what we now know and the way Caldwell has been tracking Evan ever since she died, it's clear he pushed her car off that bridge. He hunted her and the baby she carried because he believed she'd ruined herself and needed saving in his own twisted way." Caleb shut the folder, his hands trembling. "All these years," he whispered, "he was there, following Evan, watching him grow up alone. And I never even knew I had a son." Helen placed a gentle hand on his good arm. "Grace hid you from him. She hid Evan from you. She thought she was protecting both of you from Caldwell." Caleb sank back in his chair, the truth settling heavy in his bones. Grace hadn't run from him. She had run from a man who believed control was love, who had taken everything from her and had spent 14 years trying to finish the job with her child. Caleb lifted the photograph of Caldwell one more time. There was no fear in his eyes now, only a quiet, burning resolve. "If he comes for Evan again," Caleb said softly, "he's going to find a very different ending waiting for him." Detective Helen Brooks remained calm as she laid out the pieces of the truth, but Caleb felt a storm building inside him, slow and heavy. The quiet kind, the kind that didn't roar, but carried destruction all the same. He stood by the small window overlooking the hospital parking lot, watching the headlights drift past in the gathering dusk while Helen continued speaking in her steady way. "Caldwell didn't stop with Grace," she said. "Once she was gone, he turned his attention to Evan. In his mind, that boy represented everything he believed ruined her life." Caleb closed his eyes. His son, a child he had never known, hunted by his own blood. Helen continued. "From the moment Grace died, Caldwell tracked Evan through the foster system. Every placement, every school, every move. He found him again and again. And every time Evan grew old enough to look more like his mother, Caldwell's anger deepened." Caleb's grip tightened on the windowsill. "But it changed in the last few months," Helen said. Something triggered him to escalate. When Evan started coming near the clubhouse, Caldwell realized the truth Evan hadn't yet fully uncovered. He realized Evan was finding his way to you. Caleb's breath caught. So he wanted to stop him. Helen nodded. He made up his mind that Evan couldn't be allowed to reach you. In his distorted sense of justice, the boy represented Grace's greatest mistake. Ending Evan's life in Caldwell's mind meant erasing that mistake. Caleb stared down the hallway toward ICU, where machines kept steady watch over the brave boy who had nearly died in his arms. But Lily, he whispered. Why target her? Helen hesitated only a moment before answering. Because Caldwell wasn't just erasing Grace. He wanted to erase you too. Completely. Thoroughly. The weight of her words pressed down like a tombstone. He saw Lily as another branch of the same tree. She said, "Your child. Your legacy." In his mind, if Grace had been ruined by you, then anything connected to you was part of that rot. He believed destroying both children, yours and hers, was balancing the scales. Caleb felt a coldness gather deep in his stomach, something far more painful than the wound in his shoulder. He thought of Lily's laughter, her drawings, her small hands holding his each morning when he walked her to school. He thought of Evan fighting to breathe while machines kept count of each fragile heartbeat. And then he thought of a man who had twisted love into something unrecognizable. Helen's voice softened. Caleb, I've seen men justify terrible things. But Caldwell, he truly believes he's the hero of this story. Believes he's cleansing something broken. In his mind, he's carrying out Grace's unfinished path, even though Grace never wanted that. Caleb shook his head slowly. She wanted peace. Safety. She was protecting him. Protecting Evan. She was running from Caldwell, not from us. Yes, Helen said. And now he's trying to finish what he started 14 years ago. Silence stretched between them for a long moment. The kind of silence found in old country churches before the choir begins. Heavy, honest, full of truth that aches. Caleb finally turned from the window. He came for my daughter. And Evan. Both of them. His voice broke, then steadied. He nearly killed a child who had nothing. A child who still saved Lily without knowing anything about her. Helen nodded. Caldwell sees you as the root of his rage. By destroying what you love, he believes he's restoring some twisted balance. Caleb drew a slow breath, the kind that came from places deeper than anger. But he's wrong, he said quietly. This isn't justice. It's cruelty wearing a mask. He stepped into the hallway, gazing toward Evan's room as though the boy might somehow hear him. He went after the wrong children, Caleb whispered. And the wrong father. Helen watched him, understanding, passing between them like an old truth. That's why we have every officer looking for him. But Caleb, men like Caldwell don't hide forever. When they believe they're on a righteous mission, they always come back. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. He knew she was right. And when Thomas Caldwell came back, Caleb Morgan would be waiting not with vengeance, but with the fierce love of a father protecting both of his children. The night had settled gently over Riverside the way it often did in late autumn, carrying that quiet stillness only small towns truly knew. Inside County General, the lights glowed soft and warm, casting gentle halos over the freshly waxed floors. Nurses moved with practiced calm, their voices hushed as they checked on patients. To anyone passing by, it might have looked like an ordinary night in a hospital that had already seen more than its share of heartbreak. But beneath the surface, a tension lingered like a low hum. Caleb felt it. Detective Helen Brooks felt it. Even the night shift nurses sensed something in the air, though they couldn't have said why. Caleb stood near Evan's room, one hand resting on the doorframe, listening to the monitor's steady rhythm inside. Each beep felt like a small promise that the boy was still fighting. Helen approached with 2 coffees, offering one to him without a word. Her eyes swept the hallway, alert but tired. Security has every entrance covered, she murmured. If Caldwell is anywhere near this building, we'll know. Caleb nodded, but a father's instinct tugged at him in a way police reports couldn't ease. The ache in his shoulder throbbed, reminding him of the fight he had already survived, yet he found himself wishing he could take on a dozen more if it meant keeping Evan and Lily safe. The fire alarm shattered the quiet. A shrill, piercing cry rose through the 5th floor, echoing down every hallway like a warning bell ringing from a distant church steeple. Red lights began to flash. Nurses hurried out of their stations. Somewhere down the hall, a gurney scraped against the floor. And in that instant, Caleb knew. "He's here," he whispered. Helen's hand went to her holster, her jaw tightening. "Stay behind me." But Caleb stepped out into the hallway instead, his body tightening with a resolve he didn't need words to explain. A father didn't hide behind anyone when danger came for his children. Smoke didn't fill the air. There was no smell of fire, no confusion in the staff beyond the alarm itself. It wasn't a true emergency. It was a diversion. Footsteps echoed from the far stairwell, slow, steady, purposeful. Helen took a few steps forward, her voice firm and commanding. "Caleb, back up. Now." But he shook his head. From the shadows near the stairwell door emerged a tall, rigid figure. His clothes were ordinary, but everything about the man felt wrong. Cold eyes. Military posture. Controlled movements. Thomas Caldwell stepped into the blinking red light as calmly as if he were entering his own living room. He held a gun in his hand. Helen raised her own weapon. Thomas Caldwell put the gun down, but Caldwell didn't look at her. His gaze locked on Caleb. "You should have stayed out of this," Caldwell said quietly, his voice calm enough to chill bone. "Grace lost her life because she chose you. I won't let her son make the same mistake." Caleb stepped forward, his voice rough but steady. "Grace didn't die because of me. She died because you couldn't let her live her own life." Caldwell's jaw twitched. "I saved her from losing herself, and now I'll finish saving what's left." He raised the gun. Helen shouted, "Thomas, don't," and moved to intercept, but Caldwell was already shifting his aim. Toward Evan's room, toward the boy lying defenseless, just feet away. Caleb didn't think. His feet hit the floor before his mind caught up. He lunged forward, slamming his shoulder into Caldwell just as the gun fired. The shot cracked through the hallway like thunder. Glass shattered at the far end, a spray of fragments sparkling under the alarm's pulsing lights. Caldwell stumbled back, momentarily thrown off balance. Helen fired once, a warning shot into the wall beside him, forcing him to take cover behind a rolling supply cart. Chaos erupted. Nurses screamed. A security guard rushed in from the elevator, only to duck as Caldwell fired blindly toward him. Helen shouted orders, pushing staff toward the far exit. Caleb, breathing hard, scrambled back to his feet. He wasn't a soldier or a cop, but he was a father, and he would not let this man take another child. Caldwell's voice rose above the noise, bitter and cracked with old fury. That boy should never have existed. He ruined her. Caleb stepped toward him again, his voice breaking but strong. "He didn't ruin her. He's all she left behind. And I'll die before I let you touch him." Caldwell raised the gun again, but this time he didn't get the shot off. A heavy impact slammed him from behind one of the security guards, tackling him to the ground. The gun skittered across the floor. Helen rushed in, pinning Caldwell's arms while the guard secured the cuffs. The hallway fell quiet except for the distant wail of the alarm. Caleb leaned against the wall, breath shaking, the weight of what almost happened pressing deep into his chest. Helen stood, exhaling slowly. "It's over," she said. But Caleb looked toward Evan's door, the truth settling heavy in his bones. "No," he whispered. "It ends when that boy wakes up, when he knows he's finally safe." And with that, he stepped back into the room where his son fought for another day of life, determined to be the father he should have been all along. Long after the alarms were silenced and the last echoes of chaos faded from the 5th floor, a heavy stillness settled over County General. Nurses moved quietly through the hall, checking on shaken patients and straightening equipment, knocked astray in the frantic moments before Caldwell's arrest. The world in its ordinary way attempted to stitch itself back together. Caleb sat on the edge of a small treatment cot near the ICU wing as a nurse cleaned a scrape along his forearm. The cut wasn't deep, just another mark added to a body that already carried years of scars from living hard and surviving harder. But the dull sting carried a deeper meaning. He had come one breath away from losing a son he'd only just found. "You're lucky," the nurse murmured gently, pressing a fresh bandage into place. "A little farther to the left and that glass could have cut tendon." Caleb nodded, though his mind wasn't in the room. It was down the hall behind a wall of glass and soft beeping monitors. He flexed his fingers out of habit, more to reassure himself that he still could than for any medical reason. Helen Brooks stepped into the room, her posture tired but firm. "Security has Caldwell in a holding cell. He's not going anywhere tonight." Caleb glanced up, relief touching his features but not softening them. "Good." Helen studied him a moment. "You did everything a father could have done back there." Caleb shook his head slowly. "I should have known sooner. I should have protected Grace. I should have found Evan. There are a lot of should-haves in my life, Helen." She stepped closer, her voice as gentle as a steadying hand on the shoulder. "Regret doesn't raise children, Caleb. Love does. And you're here now. That matters more than anything in his file." For the first time that night, Caleb allowed himself a long, slow breath. Then he rose from the cot, thanking the nurse before walking back toward the ICU. Each step echoed with a mix of fear, hope, and exhaustion. When he reached Evan's room, the lights inside were dimmed to a soft glow. Machines blinked, their quiet rhythms casting tiny reflections across the floor. The teenager lay still beneath the blankets, his face pale but peaceful, the lines of pain softened in sleep. Caleb eased into the chair beside the bed, that same chair he had hardly left since the shooting. He sat slowly, resting his bandaged arm on his lap, and let the weight of the moment wash over him. The boy looked so young under all those wires, so small, so undeserving of every hardship that had followed him from the moment his mother was lost. Caleb rubbed a hand across his face, blinking back the sting in his eyes. "You should have had a home," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "A real childhood. A daddy who tucked you in, not strangers who kept their distance. You deserved better than the world gave you, son." He leaned forward just slightly, letting his hand rest near Evan's on the blanket, not touching yet, just close enough to let the boy feel the presence of someone who cared if he drifted even halfway to waking. "You're safe now," Caleb murmured. "I don't know if I'll ever deserve the chance to be your father, but I'm going to try anyway. I'm going to show you that you matter. That you always mattered." The monitors beeped on a steady lullaby in the quiet room. Caleb sat there as the minutes slipped by, then an hour, maybe two. He didn't look at the clock. Fathers didn't count time when their children needed them. Every so often he'd glance toward the door where a security guard now stood, posted by order of the department. Caldwell couldn't come near the boy again. Not tonight, not ever. But the shadow of what almost happened lingered like a chill. Caleb watched Evan's chest rise and fall in slow, steady breaths. "Whenever you're ready," he whispered, leaning close. "You wake up, and I'll be right here." His voice softened, warm as an old porch light guiding someone home. "I'm not leaving you again. Not this time." And with that quiet promise, Caleb settled deeper into the chair, keeping vigil through the night like a father who finally understood just how precious one fragile life could be. The soft morning light filtered slowly through the narrow ICU window, bringing a gentle warmth that touched the room like a careful hand. For the first time in days, the sky outside was calm, brushed with soft gold instead of storm-gray clouds. It was a morning that seemed meant for new beginnings. Caleb had fallen asleep in the chair beside Evan's bed, his chin resting against his chest, one hand still near the boy's on the blanket. He hadn't realized the night had slipped away from him. Exhaustion had claimed him only after hours of watching every rise and fall of Evan's chest, afraid that if he dared to blink too long, something might change. What woke him wasn't an alarm or a nurse entering the room. It was movement. A faint shift of blankets. A soft, strained exhale. Caleb's eyes opened instantly. He sat up straight, breath catching in his throat as he saw Evan's fingers twitch just slightly, then curl again. The boy's eyelids fluttered, struggling like someone pulling back a heavy curtain for the first time. Evan, Caleb whispered, leaning forward, his heart pounding in a way he hadn't felt in years. Son, can you hear me? The boy's lashes lifted slowly, revealing unfocused eyes that blinked at the ceiling as if it were unfamiliar. For a moment he seemed lost between two worlds, the quiet place he had been resting in, and the harsh one waiting for him. He swallowed, the movement small but visible. His lips parted. Lily, the word was thin, shaky, barely more than breath. Caleb felt the sting of tears at the back of his eyes. Of all the things the boy might have asked first, who he was, where he was, what happened, his first thought was for the little girl he had shielded with his own body. She's safe, Caleb said gently, moving a little closer, speaking with the warm steadiness a father uses to calm a frightened child. You did that. You saved her, Evan. The boy blinked again as if trying to bring Caleb's face into focus. She's okay, she's perfect, Caleb assured him, his voice soft but full of certainty. Not a scratch. She's been drawing you pictures every single day, waiting for you to wake up. She calls you the brave boy. A small breath escaped Evan's lips, a sound that might have been relief, might have been disbelief. His eyes drifted toward Caleb, confusion flickering across his bruised features. Caleb reached out slowly, giving the boy time to pull away if he wished, and set his hand lightly on the edge of the blanket. Not touching Evan yet, just close enough for him to feel safe. You're in the hospital, he said softly. You've been here for several days. You fought hard, son. Harder than most grown men I've ever met. At that, Evan's brow wrinkled faintly. Why are you here? Caleb felt the question land deep. It came from years of no one ever staying, no one ever choosing him. Years of doors closing, of footsteps walking away. The boy wasn't asking out of anger, he was asking because he didn't know what it felt like to belong to anyone. I'm here, Caleb said, voice steady, but thick with emotion. Because you're not alone anymore? Because someone should have been at your side your whole life, and that someone was supposed to be me. Evan blinked. The words seemed too big to understand all at once. Caleb swallowed hard and continued. Your mother, Grace, she and I were together once. I didn't know she was expecting you. She kept it from me because she was scared. She thought she had to protect you from a world that had already hurt her. The boy's eyes glistened, not from pain, but from something deeper, something wounded and raw. So you're, he whispered. Yes, Caleb said gently. I'm your father. Silence wrapped around them, heavy, fragile, sacred. Evan turned his head just slightly toward him, and though his face was pale and weak, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. A quiet sense that maybe after a lifetime of shadows, someone had finally stepped into the light beside him. Caleb leaned forward, voice trembling with the truth he had waited 16 years to say. I'm here, Evan, and I'm not going anywhere. You've got a place now. You've got people who care. You've got a family waiting to meet you when you're ready. A tear slipped down Evan's temple, one single drop that held a lifetime of hurt. And with the smallest nod barely visible, he whispered the word Caleb had prayed to hear, okay. Evan's recovery unfolded the way a fragile sunrise does after a long night. Not sudden, not bright all at once, but slow and patient, warming the world a little more each day. The doctors warned that healing would take time. They spoke of physical therapy, scar tissue, headaches that might linger, and the exhaustion that would pull him under without warning. But Evan had survived too much already to shy away from the slow climb back to life. Each morning, Caleb arrived early with 2 cups of coffee, one for himself and one left on the small windowsill for the nurses who had taken to checking on Evan more often than protocol required. In the quiet hours just after dawn, father and son would sit together saying very little. Words were hard for Evan some days. Trust even harder. But Caleb understood silence in a way only a man who had lived through his own share of storms could. Sometimes Lily came bursting in like a ray of summer sun, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, her hair tied in crooked pigtails because she'd insisted on doing them herself. She'd climb gently into the chair beside Evan's bed, swinging her feet in the air. Are you feeling better today? She'd ask with big, earnest eyes. And even on his hardest mornings, Evan would try to smile for her. A little. She'd nod satisfied, then pull out crayons from her backpack. Good. Then I can show you what I made. There were drawings, so many drawings. Pictures of the three of them standing in front of a little house. Pictures of Evan with a cape. Pictures of a motorcycle with hearts floating around it. Some drawings had spelling mistakes that made Caleb chuckle, but Evan kept every single one. The boy who had once owned nothing now had a stack of hand-colored treasures he kept on the hospital tray like priceless artifacts. Physical therapy began slowly. A kind therapist named Marjorie guided Evan through simple movements, first lifting his arm, straightening his fingers, taking small steps supported by rails. Evan's legs trembled that first day and he clenched his jaw hard, refusing to cry out even when the pain was sharp. Caleb walked beside him, one steady hand hovering at Evan's back, not quite touching, but always there. "You're doing good," Caleb said softly. "Better than good, son." Evan took another step, breath shaky, but determined. "Feels like I'm learning to walk all over again." Caleb nodded. "Then we take it slow." Nothing wrong with slow. After therapy sessions, Caleb would help him settle back in bed, adjusting his pillows with gentle care. Evan wasn't used to being looked after. The simple kindness of it, someone noticing when he was tired, someone remembering he liked the window shade partly open, someone being there every hour of every day, felt strange, unfamiliar, almost frightening. But a small part of him, the part still learning how to breathe without fear, found comfort in it. Evenings were the softest time. Lily often came back after school, sitting on the end of the bed to talk about her day. Sometimes Caleb read aloud from old books his own father once loved. Stories about simple folks, small towns, and hearts trying to find their way. Evan listened quietly, letting the warm cadence of Caleb's voice settle into the cracks life had carved into him. One night, as the sky outside deepened into a gentle indigo, Evan spoke up without prompting. "I never had this," he said quietly, eyes fixed on his hands. "People staying, coming back." Caleb's chest tightened. He reached out and rested his hand, not too heavy, just steady, on Evan's forearm. "Well, you have it now." Evan swallowed hard. "What if I don't know how to be in a family?" Caleb's answer came slow and tender. "Then we learn together. Families aren't perfect. We just show up day after day. That's all." From her chair, Lily nodded seriously. "Daddy's right. You don't have to know anything yet. You just stay with us." Evan looked at the two of them, the little girl with soft certainty in her eyes, and the man who had nearly lost both his children in one terrible night, and something inside him began to settle. Something that had been trembling for years finally found a place to rest. For the first time in his life, Evan allowed himself to believe he wasn't passing through someone else's world. He was becoming part of one. Winter settled slowly over Riverside, laying a soft hush across the small town like a quilt stitched with old stories and second chances. The first snowfall came early that year, dusting rooftops and lawns in a layer of quiet white. And in the little house at the edge of town, the kind with creaking porch boards and a warm glow in the windows, life was beginning again for a boy who had once believed he belonged nowhere. Evan stood on the front steps, wrapped in a thick jacket Caleb had bought him, watching the flakes drift down. They caught in his dark hair, melted against his warm breath, clung to the fabric of his sleeves. For a long moment, he simply let himself feel it, the peace of a winter morning with no fear behind it. No footsteps following him. No silver sedan crawling down the street. No shadows from the past stretching over his shoulders. Just cold air. Just quiet. Just a home. Behind him, the screen door squeaked open and Lily came bouncing out with the kind of excitement only a 7-year-old could muster before sunrise. She shoved a pair of mismatched mittens into his hands. "You forgot these," she said proudly. "They're warm." Grandma knitted them before she went to heaven. Evan looked at the little mittens, one blue and one green wool, slightly uneven. He slid them on carefully. "Thanks." "You're welcome," Lily said. And then softer, "We're making pancakes. Daddy said you get to pick the kind because you're finally home." The word settled deep inside him. Home. It still felt fragile when he heard it. Precious. something he held carefully, afraid it could vanish if he squeezed too tight. Inside, Caleb flipped pancakes on the griddle, humming the same old tune his own father used to sing on winter mornings. When he saw Evan step in, cheeks red from the cold, he smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Hungry, son?" Evan nodded. Yeah. A little." Caleb set a plate in front of him, adding extra blueberries without being asked. "Good. You need to keep your strength. Your physical therapist is going to put you through the ringer today." Evan smirked softly, still getting used to the gentle teasing. "I can handle it." "I know you can," Caleb replied, pride in every word. As they ate, Lily chattered about school, about the snowman she planned to build, about the holiday concert coming up where she would sing in the front row. Evan listened quietly, taking in each small detail as though storing them somewhere safe inside him. These were normal moments, ordinary moments, the kind he'd never imagined having. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft amber, the three of them gathered by the fireplace. Lily was drawing again, sprawled across the living room rug. Caleb sorted through old photo boxes, some containing images of Grace, pictures he'd been afraid to open for years. He handed one gently to Evan. It was a photograph of Grace at 19, her smile bright and full of hope. "She was a good person," Caleb said quietly, his voice thick with memory. "And she loved you more than you'll ever know. She tried her best to protect you. I want you to remember that." Evan traced the edges of the picture with careful fingers. "I wish I could have known her." Caleb reached out, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder, steady, sure, full of the warmth Evan had longed for all his life. "She'd be proud of you, for surviving, for fighting, for being the young man you've become." Evan swallowed hard, blinking back emotion. "Do you really want me here?" Caleb didn't hesitate. "I thank God every day that you're here." Lily looked up from her drawing. "You're my brother," she said simply, as though it were the most obvious truth in the world. "Brothers stay." And just like that, something inside Evan settled in a way it never had before. For the first time, he felt the ground beneath him wasn't going to shift. That evening, as they gathered for dinner, Caleb bowed his head to say grace. His voice trembled slightly. "Thank you," he said, "for new beginnings. For the people who come into our lives when we need them most. And for the second chances that remind us it's never too late to love or be loved." Evan lifted his eyes and looked around the table at Caleb, at Lily, at the soft glow of the lamp, the snow falling quietly outside, and the warmth he felt blooming somewhere deep in his chest. This was family, not because of blood, though blood had brought them together in the end, but because of the choice they made every day to show up, to stay, to love, even when it hurt. Home wasn't a place you found. It was a place that welcomed you in and whispered you belong. And Evan knew he had finally arrived.